Thank you for joining us at One Church. If you'd like to know more about us, you can simply visit our website, onechurchjoplin.org. We would like to stay connected with you throughout the week wherever you go, and the simplest way for you to do that is to like our Facebook page, where we post all of our content. And you can always come visit us Sunday morning at 9:30 a.m. or 11 a.m. I believe that you're here for a reason, and God has something He wants to say specifically to you. And my hope for you is that by the end of this video, you feel closer to God than you ever have before.
And we're excited to have you here with us today. We will conclude this next week. It'll be our last week of this series. But this week, we're going to jump right in. We're just talking about the messes that we deal in life and how we are messes altogether. We've talked about that from week to week. But this week, have you ever yourself made a mess messier? Anyone ever dealt with that? There's people like, yes, I can relate to this message. So if I can share a story from my own life, if you don't mind, as I open up today. I used to have a red 97 Ford Expedition. And I was in college at the time, or maybe just freshly out of college, and I was living in a house over on Harlem, 18th and Harlem, and I thought it would be great to have this Expedition. I was a youth pastor and hauled a lot of kids around. I could haul a lot of stuff around. It was a great little vehicle, a great big vehicle to have for that kind of stuff. And then I got the great idea that I wanted to paint my dining room at my house red. And if anyone's ever tried to paint with red, you know it doesn't cover well. It takes multiple coats to paint something red. I don't know why that is, but it's just the truth. So if you're considering that, there you go. But in the process of this, I had to buy lots of red paint. And I used my 97 Ford Expedition to transport this red paint. And for some reason, I thought it would be a good idea, or I didn't think about it at all, to put those in the front seat of my car on the seat. And as I'm driving home, I hit the brakes abruptly. I don't remember what it was, but I'm sure it was to save an old woman or a child or something like that. But in the process of this, 2 gallons of red paint catapult off of my front seat into the floorboard of my car. The lids pop off, and I don't know what happens physically when something like a liquid like paint falls, but it doesn't just fall peacefully. When it falls, it like drops and pops back up, and my car looks like someone gutted a deer inside of it. Like it's everywhere. And it's on me, it's on the windshield, it's on the roof, it's all over the inside of this vehicle. And this is before Pinterest. There was no going to Pinterest and say, how do you get red paint out of a Ford Expedition? Like, I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I'm covered in paint. And the only thing I could think to do at the time was go directly to the car wash before it could dry. And so what do? I go to the car wash, and I just open the door and put every quarter I can find into that machine, and I just start power washing the inside of my car. And in the process of power washing this, it doesn't get better. It just starts spreading the paint all over the whole vehicle. And I just remember thinking, and it wouldn't go away. Every time it looked like my carpet was gray, it would seep back up again. So I'd spray more and it would seep back up again. And I would take it over to the vacuum and I'd vacuum up. And those poor people at that car wash probably thinking, who murdered someone here? Like, what happened? Are they hiding the evidence? What happened? So shortly after that, I sold that vehicle. I couldn't drive it anymore. I was done with that red Expedition. It was red on the inside and the outside. But so I've had this moment where I tried to take care of a mess, and I made a big mess a bigger mess. And so often in our life, when we deal with messes, when we get caught up in things financially, morally, relationally, academically, professionally, there's going to be options. There's going to be bad options on how we handle those situations. And sometimes these things, they're not always the best fix. Sometimes we make things worse. I can tell you for a fact, I've taught the Dave Ramsey Financial Peace University class multiple times. And this testimony gets shared all the time. That when someone gets in a financial mess and their bills are stacked up, they're piling up and they can't pay things off, for some reason, one of the responses that people have that to remedy this is go and get a title loan. And I've met dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have gone to do the title loan, and I've never met one of them that it worked out well. It's like someone when you get into drugs. I've never seen someone that, like, show me the drug user that it ended well. Like, show me the one, like, this is how you handle it. Show me the one that won. It's just the truth. And so in this circumstance, we try to handle the mess, and we make a bigger mess. And it's just the truth. And so, or sometimes we tell a lie. Anyone ever told a lie? If you're not raising your hand now, you're lying to me now. But sometimes in the way that we handle a lie, what do? We tell a bigger lie to cover up and take care of the first lie. And then it snowballs. I've been there, you know. Julie thought I was a French model when she met me, and now she knows the truth. No, I'm kidding. I'm lying to you now. Anyway, or what do we do when we have conflict in our life and we don't want to deal with the conflict? Sometimes we hide. We just hide. We retreat. We hide from it instead of just taking care of it, and we create a bigger mess. You ever like hid from somebody when they came to the door? Like, don't answer the door. Everybody down. Don't make any noise. Or they call and you're like, you're screening your calls. Careful screening your calls when your children hold your phone. Bella is queen of this. She'll be playing like, hey, Dad, you got a phone call. It's whatever you say. It's Mom. I have to be careful not to say like, hey, don't answer that, because sometimes she's already answered and handed me the phone, and I don't want Julie. Don't answer that. I don't know whether Bella has always answered it or not. So be careful. Be careful. I don't know why I would say don't answer Mom's phone call. It was just an example. Or sometimes when we do something bad, maybe we think that the way to handle it is to destroy the evidence. My youngest daughter, Gabby, she's not supposed to take food out of the kitchen or to their bedrooms especially. Not supposed to do that. And she knows that she's not supposed to do that. And what she does is she takes it to her room and she tries to hide the evidence, or in her mind, destroy it. And you'll be in her room helping her clean up or make her bed, and all of a sudden you see all these brownie wrappers and chip containers and cracker packages. And you'd be like, Gabby, did you eat in your room? No. Well, what's this? Oh, that. You know, she thinks in her mind, and what she's done now is she's lied and she's created a bigger mess for herself. So that's what I want to talk about, these options that we get presented with as quick fixes, but in the end, they make things worse. And I know for me that sometimes we make things messier. And that's what I want to talk about today is the How do we keep from making things messy? So everyone say Yeah. Anyway. As we do that, I want to share a story from the Old Testament where the main character models for us how not to make a mess even messier. And we're going to do that with the story of David. So if you have a Bible with you, open up to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 18. And we're going to cruise by there here in just a moment. But let's give you some context. This is about 1,000 years BC. David was a shepherd boy, and the prophet Samuel came to his house, and he anointed him to be king of Israel. So David was a wee little shepherd boy. A wee little shepherd boy was he, content with doing just that. But God has a greater call on his life than to just be a lowly shepherd boy. But there's just one problem for him to be anointed as the next king of Israel. Israel already had a king. His name was King Saul. And if you know anything about kings, kings don't like any competition for the throne. I don't know any kings, but I'm assuming this to be correct from every movie I've ever seen. They don't handle competition well. And so King Saul, we'll come back to him later, doesn't like David. And so what happens to David? David, he's just going about his life, and he goes to visit his brothers who are in battle, And as he does that, there's this mean Philistine that's causing some havoc. He's not cooperating with people. And David thinks, you know what? Somebody needs to take care of this bully, and no one is willing to do it. So David, not being the biggest guy in town, he steps up and he takes care of this villainous Philistine, and he takes him out. We know the story with the sling and the rocks, and he becomes an overnight sensation. And this is before Twitter, this is before any Vines, this is before Snapchat, anything like that. But this goes viral, and he becomes an overnight sensation. And the public is wild about some David, if you know what I mean. And all of a sudden, Saul is getting word of how popular David is. Well, David's popular because he is chosen by God. So if you or I were to go and try and defeat the Philistine, we would fail probably miserably because he's stronger, he's faster. I'm not chosen, but David was. And because of this, he gains popularity. And all of a sudden, people are like, King Saul, who? And they're loving them some David. And Saul feared and was jealous of David. And so this is where we enter our text right here. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 14. In everything he did, he had great success. This is David we're talking about. And in verse 15, when Saul saw how successful David was, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. And when leaders lead in the way that he did, people love them. And so what does Saul think of to try and combat David's popularity? He says, you know what I need to do? I need to eliminate him. I need to off this guy. But he's so liked by the public, he's so liked by my kingdom that I can't do it with my hands. He was smart enough to know that if he were the one to eradicate David, that people would hold it against him because he was so popular and it wouldn't bid well for him. So what does he do? He comes up with this plan. Saul plans to marry off one of his daughters. That's a good dad. That's a good dad. Saul tries to marry off one of his daughters in order to control David. In his mind, he thinks, you know what? If I become his father-in-law and he's in love with my wife, I'll have control of him, I can manipulate him, and that will take care of my problem. He can send him off to war, he can take care of him, something, whatever. He can control him. But in Saul's futile attempt to manipulate David through the power of one of his daughters, he makes David more popular. Because what does David do? He refuses the hand of his daughter. And then every mortal man around the kingdom is saying, are you kidding me? You had the opportunity to marry his daughter and you didn't choose royalty? And now people are looking at him and they're, and he earns this new name, David the Humble. Who is this guy? He is too good for words. This guy is better than sliced bread, which they know nothing about yet. He turns down royalty. Who does this? So later on, it backfires for Saul again. He tries to give one of his daughters to David, but later on, another of his daughters, Michal, actually falls in love with David. And so then Saul tries to take advantage of this situation. He says, this is good. So he sets a bride price on his daughter. And so for David to take the hand of his daughter, he has to do something to take it. And so Saul sets a price on her of this. If you want my daughter, she's yours for the price of 100 Philistines. He wants him to bring him the evidence, the blood evidence of 100 dead Philistines. And so in his mind, he's thinking, there's no way that David and his merry men can go and defeat 100 Philistines. This will take care of David. And he didn't have to do it with his own hands. All he was doing was trying to win the affection of his daughter. This is a simple plan. So we go forward. Saul says to himself in verse 17, I will not raise a hand against him. I will let the Philistines do that. So what happens? David does not kill 100 Philistines. They actually killed 200. And he becomes even more popular. He wasn't successful at 100. He kills 200 of them. And he brings back a bath of evidence to prove what he's done. And in verse 28, we jump over. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, and he couldn't manipulate her because she really loved him, Saul became still more afraid of him because Saul knew the truth. He knew the truth that David was anointed. Because every time he tried to do something, it backfired. Every time he tried to take care of him, Saul became weaker, he became less, David became more popular, he became more loved, and because of this, he's shaken in his boots. Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. So Saul has a mess, and this is how he chooses to address his mess. He tries to eliminate David. Instead of just trying to figure out a way to bow out peacefully or to make, hey, maybe we could do this kingdom thing together, or maybe we could be a part of this family and we could be a royal family all together. He's threatened by his existence. And how does he try to handle the mess? By making it messier. And it doesn't end well for Saul. Well, David, on the other hand, has a huge mess on his hands because everything that David is dealing with, he hasn't asked for. David was a shepherd boy that was fine with being a shepherd. He didn't ask to be the next king of Israel. He didn't ask for Saul's daughter's hand in marriage. For crying out loud, he turned one of them down and the other one came after him. He was just that undeniable. I can't relate to that. So eventually Saul does try to kill him. And what does David do? Saul tries to kill him with his own hands and he flees. Because he is the number one threat to Saul's dynasty. And he knows now that Saul is desperate to kill him. And he will do it when he has the chance. So David gathers around him all of the outcasts, all of the rejects, those that have been persecuted by Saul, and they become loyal to David. I'm sure it wasn't hard to sell. And meanwhile, Saul becomes obsessed with killing David to preserve his son's right to the throne. And I have to picture that Saul has got to be approaching the point of insanity because he knows that everything he does doesn't work. And it's got to be something that's eating at him because it's threatening his livelihood. It's threatening his way of life. It's threatening the things that he worships, the thing that he holds dear, himself and his monarchy. And so David has this mess on his hand, and it's not his fault. He's the victim. He didn't choose to be anointed the kid king. The Goliath thing, all he did was show up. God had blessed him, and it happened to go his way. He didn't try to marry the king's daughter. It happened anyway. He led every dangerous campaign he was assigned to, and he was always successful. But we go on here, and we see if what we're about to discover was true for David, it's undoubtedly true for the messes that we have in our life. So after Saul returns, 1 Samuel 24, verse 1. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines near the Mediterranean Sea, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So all of a sudden, he has a location of where David is. He knows where David is. So Saul says, let's take 3,000 able-bodied young men from Israel, and we'll all set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. And so I'm saying this, and you're like, okay, what's this mean? Well, let me give you a picture here of what this looks like. So you see these little holes in the rocks. This isn't like this very easy place to get to. This is where David is hanging out. And I don't know why David is here. Okay, that I don't know. But Saul finds out that this is where he is. And so this is where this takes place. It says that he came to the sheep pens along the way, and a cave was there. And, well, Saul has this sudden urge for the bathroom, if you know what I mean. He's got to go do number one. And there's not many points in the Bible that talk about bathroom situations. So I'm just going to stop and reflect on this for a moment. So Saul has to relieve himself. I said, I know of one other one. There's a point in Deuteronomy 23:12 that says when you have to go, find a place outside the camp in which to relieve yourself. I actually put that on a camp shirt for our kids one year. But Saul has to relieve himself. He has to go to the bathroom. And it's funny because instead of just doing it like probably most of the guys did, he's modest. And he's like, oh, there's a cave. I'm going to go into the cave to relieve myself. So he goes into the cave, and what do we know about caves? They're dark. That's probably all we know about caves. So he goes into this cave, and it's dark. So here he comes to the sheep pens along the way. The cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. But what he doesn't know in verse 3 is that David and his men were far back in the cave. So David gets word from a scout that Saul is in the cave. It's got to be blowing David's mind. Like, how does he know where we are? Has he put a homing beacon on? Like, what's going on? Of everywhere that they could be, he finds him. But Saul doesn't know that he's found him. And so in this moment right here, David knew he was coming. He was told, he was warned by the scout. And instead of running away, he confronts the mess. Instead of running away, he decides to let Saul's army march through. What are the odds that they would be in this cave at this very moment, at this very same time? Here they are. God just provided the solution to David's problem. And everybody with David recognized it. In verse 4, it says, the men said, this is the day that the Lord spoke of when he said it to you. I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. I know you just started thinking about Princess Bride, didn't you? As you wish. Anyway, but in this moment, this happens. He says, oh my gosh, they're recognizing this is what God said would happen. The enemy would be delivered into our hands for you to deal with them as you wish. But David starts to think about that situation. About how in his eyes there should be minimum bloodshed. And now there's this drama that David's caught up in. He's caught up in the emotion, and he decides, I don't know about you, but if someone's out to try and kill me and maybe kill my family, doesn't want me to have children someday, doesn't want me to breathe another breath, if that's what's happening, I'm going to take care of the situation. I'm a proud NRA member. I pack, I carry, because if you're going to threaten me, I'm going to threaten you back. You bet. Now, I don't go pursuing it, but I'm going to protect my family. And in this situation, he would be justified in self-defense to take care of himself. Self-defense. And so in this moment, David has this opportunity. Do unto him. Do unto him. David had told the guys that God had promised him. And this was that moment that there would be minimum bloodshed. And so Saul goes in, and David walks out. So you got to think about everybody that's there, you know, all the people that are there in that moment. Saul goes in, David comes out. What happened? Saul goes in, David comes out. What happened? What happened? Everything lined up. If there was ever a set of circumstances pointing to something, this was it. Do unto him as he has done unto me, or intends to do unto you. But then something else enters the picture for David. He could have handled this situation in any way that he chose. He said, I will deliver your enemy into your hands for you to do with as you please. But David does something that maybe we can't relate to until we hear this. David chooses another route than bloodshed. He chooses the virtuous route. There's this thing called the virtue factor. And because he chooses the virtuous route, good things happen for him. But if we are to ignore virtue, you'll eventually make a mess. We'll eventually make a mess. You can't clean up a mess caused by a failure of virtue with another failure of virtue. If we're in a relationship that we shouldn't be in, you don't clean up that mess by getting in another relationship you shouldn't be in. It's kind of like when you're in a financial mess that is really a big mess and you're in over your head. The worst thing you can do is try and deal with that financial mess by getting into another loan with a higher interest rate, with a shorter payment period. You can't do it. So here we have this situation, and it says, then David crept up, and we know now because of virtue that two wrongs don't make a right. So if we look here in 4b, then David crept up unnoticed. David has this moment where he's right here face to face with his enemy. He has the opportunity to take him out unseen, in the dark. He could take care of it, and many people, except for his men that are loyal to him, would not even have a clue who did it. But what does David do? He thinks about his story for a moment. He says, do I really want to become king by sneaking up on the king in a cave while he's relieving himself and murdering him? Is that how I want to take the throne? I mean, can you imagine that someday when he's sitting with his grandkids and his grandkids are like, Grandpa, David, tell us about how you became king. Well, Saul was walking through the cave, and he was peeing, and I murdered him in the dark. That's a pretty good story. I don't know that I'm ashamed to tell that one. But he thinks about it. What do you want your story to be? I took matters into my own hands. God anointed me, therefore God appointed me. Would he have been justified in killing Saul? Yes, absolutely. Saul was trying to eliminate him. Was it expected that he would kill Saul? Yes, absolutely. God was delivering him into his hands. Would it have been virtuous? No. No. Handling his mess with this mess would not have been virtuous. So we go back to verse 4. Then David crept up unnoticed, and he cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And even this little bitty attack, this little bitty cut that he made on the robe, would still be considered an attack on the king. So he didn't follow through with it. He just kind of went halfway. Verse 5, afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. And you got to think all the men that are with him, that have been loyal to him, that have teamed up with him, they've got to be like, David, are you kidding me? Take him out. Why are you going soft now? This is what we've waited for. God told you he would deliver him into your hands. Verse 6, he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. He says, it's not my responsibility to replace what God put in place. I don't want to become king by murdering a king. And with these words in voice 7, he says this, with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. He had to lay the smack down to stop them from killing him for him. So now, instead of him not just killing himself, he's defending Saul to his own men. No, don't kill him. What? Are you crazy? Are you mental? How would you not let us kill him? And so it says, and Saul left the cave and he went on his way. And in verse 8, then David went out of the cave and he called out to Saul, this day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. So David's kind of having this moment standing on the mouth of the cave. I'm just picturing this moment where he's like, who's the man now, dog? You were putty in my hands. You were delivered into my hands. You're alive because I let you be alive. And there's more justice to this for him seeing now, Saul just seeing how powerful David really is and how much he is anointed by God. So how does Saul respond to this? David says, I said I will not lay my hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs that you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. And isn't it funny that that's kind of how Saul started? That's kind of how Saul started. You know what, I got to take care of him without my hands touching him. If I could just figure out a way that he could be eliminated with my hand, without my hands being the ones that do it. And that's exactly what David does. He says, I'm opting for virtue over hurt you. I'm opting for the virtuous route instead of the route that hurts you. I want to do the right thing, not the expected thing. I want to do the right thing and trust God to determine the outcome. And so what happens? Saul is absolutely humiliated. There's 3,000 men there of his own and David's men. He's humiliated. And he goes on, and it doesn't happen right away, but it says 7 chapters later, a random arrow pierces Saul's armor, and David became king. So David had this defining moment when he had the opportunity to take care of Saul. And he could have done it with his own hands, but he had this virtuous moment where he says, you know what? I can let God fight my battles because he's far more creative than me. And if God put me here, God will get me there. If God got me to it, he'll get me through it. And so he has this moment to take care of it on his own. I think so often that's what we do. And when we intervene in what God has for our lives, we make it messier. Instead of doing the virtuous thing in our life, maybe it's not about what God has in our life, but instead of handling our messes that we've created with the virtuous route and just telling the truth, cutting up the credit cards, walking the other way, saying no, instead of doing that, we create a bigger mess. And every time this mess comes, every time we encounter a mess, it comes prepackaged with bad options. And what looks like a quick fix quickly becomes quicksand. I mean, we think about that, something that can fix you for just a moment. If you get in quicksand, you can stand there for a moment, and you can tread water for just a little bit, but eventually you'll get tired and you'll sink. And the further you sink, the more difficult it gets to get out of it. And it becomes this slippery slope. And that's exactly where David was. And these bad options make the mess messier. And one day your mess will be reduced to a sentence or two. And how do you want that to be remembered? So a lot of us, we're dealing with messes in our life. Maybe we've been through divorce and it was just a struggle. Maybe we're in a bad relationship right now. Maybe you've been fired from a job. Maybe you dropped out of school or flunked out of school. Maybe you've declared bankruptcy. Maybe these are things that you've dealt with and there's a mess in your life. Well, the mess isn't going to change, but what will be remembered is not the mess, but how you respond to the mess. It's how David responded to the situation. His men didn't understand it. They wanted to take matters into their own hand, and they didn't understand it at the time, but they got to see David be victorious without getting blood on his hands. Every mess comes prepackaged with bad options, but your response to the mess is the real story. What story do you want to tell? Which of your options do you want to be the permanent part of your story? The virtuous option. The option says, I came clean to her. I owned up to my mistakes. I took care of it. Because we're all going to have this option in our life, this temptation to make things messier. David had that option. Saul had that option. And we get to see directly how it pans out for two men experiencing a mess. So as we go forward, think about this. Don't add water to the flood. Don't opt for something that makes you a liar for life. And don't opt for something that makes you a hypocrite for life. And then don't use someone's bad behavior to justify your decisions. David could have easily justified his behavior by Saul's behavior. He could have justified the death. He could have justified the murder. He could have justified it because of how he was treated. But it wouldn't have been the virtuous option. So what is it that we deal with in our life today? What's the mess that you're in front of right now that's in front of you that maybe you've created, maybe the mess that you didn't ask for? But what's the virtuous option? Let's pray.